Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And the the portion that we're on now is Shlach Lecha. Again, as I mentioned, that so much of the rest of the book of Numbers has to do with these various tragedies that take place because of the complaints or the lack of faith on the part of the Israelites. And my sense is that at this particular point, I'm not here to judge the Israelites, but rather to say to myself, to what degree do I exhibit exactly these kinds of traits myself? Do I hear myself complaining the way they complain? Do I hear myself being unappreciative, the way they're unappreciative, the way they complained about the manna? Do I have a lack of trust and faith in God to take some important risks that have to do with overcoming my own impulses and conquering myself and those sorts of things? Or am I, faithless and lazy and stuff like that? So just to be really conscious of these things. So here we are. We're on as you see, we're about to start chapter 15. And what's happened now is that we've had the incident of the 12 spies. Just to review that quickly, where basically they went to reconnoiter the land and they came back, and 10 of them basically said, we'll never make it, we're not going to be able to do it. And 2 of them, that is Joshua and Caleb, both said, no, we can trust in God. I mean, look at what's happened so far. You look at the parting of the Red Sea, for example, right? That we'll be fine. God has promised this to us, and it's going to happen. And of course, when 10 people say it's awful and 2 people say it's great, who do you follow? And so the Israelites spent that whole night wailing and moaning. And essentially, that was the night of Tisha B'Av, of the 9th of Av, which represented the destruction of the 2 temples. And the way the Talmud puts it, or the rabbinic tradition puts it, God says, you wailed all night for nothing, and now I'm going to give you reason to wail. You're going to have a reason to wail. And that's why it corresponds to this particular incident. A lot of people think that it has to do with the sin of the golden calf. That is not the case. This has to do with this incident, Tisha B'Av, and the day that commemorates, if you want to call it that, the worshipping of the golden calf and the shattering of the tablets is Shivasar B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, which actually is less than a month away. It's in the next Hebrew month. So let's get started here. Okay.
How come that's not commonly observed?
Because, Judith, I could give you a simple answer, which is because people just love celebrating fast days.
Okay.
People don't observe Tisha B'Av either. It's not like people are not looking. There are actually a number of fast days. Some are not even on the calendar because they're not that kind of calendar. There's a fast, in fact, that following a festival, there is a Monday, Thursday, Monday fast on that week that follows the festival that is supposed to be an atonement for whatever you did. And this is how I understand it, for whatever you did that actually broke the rules of the festival. Maybe there's another reason that I can think of, but I don't recollect ever reading it anywhere, which is the fact that we can't observe these pilgrim festivals anymore as pilgrim festivals or offer up the gifts in the temple that God has commanded us to do. So, but I confess that that's not a fast day, those are not fast days that I personally observe, but I do try to fast on Shavasar B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av and Tzom Esther and the Asara B'Tevet. Those are the other fasts that are there. So anyway, I believe Asara B'Tevet. I'm trying to think. Okay, never mind. let's go in here. Judith, did you want to follow up at all on that question? Okay. Just if you raise your hand in your if you can, then I'll see and I'll be happy to recognize you. So here we go. So this is over. It's over. This incident is over. And we have an interesting chapter here. And it's such a contrast to this narrative that we've just read. And I love the way this responds. So, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. So, Hashem, God, spoke to Moses with saying, Daber el bnei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel, va'amarta alehem, and say to them, Ki tavo'u, when you arrive, when you come, el eretz moshvotechem, to the land of your settlements, asher ani noten lachem, which I am giving to you. And what I love about this is how this comes right after they've been told they are not going to be able to enter the land, and that that generation is going to have to die out in the wilderness. And here God is telling them, but ultimately they will. Not they themselves, but their children. So they may have to suffer the consequences of their lack of faith, but nevertheless, God is not abandoning them. And in fact, God plans still on fulfilling the promise that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and subsequently to them as well. And not only that, but the fact is that we get into halacha now. We are going to be getting into mitzvot and commandments. And there's such a beautiful contrast emotionally, I sense, between a passage that talks about ways in which we can fulfill our responsibilities to God and try to do things that are positive, in contrast to this narrative that shows human weakness and human frailty and tragedy. So just that sort of substrata of what we're reading here. So ki tavo'u, when you arrive, when you come. Basar lahem. So Rashi says it much more succinctly than I did, but he says he predicts to them, he foretells them, she kansul aretz, that in fact they will enter the land. Va'isitem ishel Adonai. And not only that, okay, there are all kinds of mitzvahs, but this particular mitzvah involves making offerings, sacrifices. It's such a contrast to what we just read, right? And you shall make an offering by fire to God, to the Lord. Here it goes, Olah. And Olah, we're familiar with that phrase. It's a whole offering. Or Zevach, or another kind of offering, lifalei neder, to fulfill an oath, or bindava, or as a gift, right? This is so a neder is when you take an oath and you say, I am committing myself to bringing an animal. Nidava is when you devote a specific animal, when you point out a specific animal and say, I'm devoting this to God, I'm giving this as an offering to God. Or b'mo'adechem, or in your appointed seasons, and the mo'adot, of course, are Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. La'asot, in order, reach nichoach, a pleasing pleasing fragrance, l'Adonai, to the Lord, min habakar, from your cattle, or min hason, or from your flock. So look where we're going here. What an incredible contrast to what we just read. Rashi, va'asitem ishet, and you bring a offering of fire. Ein zet tzivui. This is not a commandment as such. Ella, but it's simply saying keshetava'u sham, when you arrive there. In other words, it's not commanding a specific offering, but it's saying when you happen to be in these circumstances, right? When you arrive there, v'ta'aleh alevavchem, and it should arise in your hearts. In other words, you yourself, you freely wish la'asot, to perform. Excuse me, I may be stuck. Good, okay. Ishel Hashem, to bring this offering by fire to God. Or lefalei neder could be to fulfill an oath expressed, or bindava, or as a gift, a donation, etc. Or shita'asu, or in another case, that you perform ha'isher, this offering by fire, bishvil chovat mo'adechem, on account of the obligation, right? This is not an obligation. This is an obligation. In this particular case, you've placed the obligation upon yourself. But in the case of the obligation of the appointed seasons, right? This is something shechayavti etchem, which I placed upon you. I obligated you la'asot b'moed, to perform at the appointed season. Reach nichoach, lovely explanation of this expression of pleasing fragrance. Sheyeh nachat ruach lefanai, that it should give me, that is God speaking, nachas. Right, and now you know. So nachat means linchot. Lenachot is to rest, to come down, to alight. And it's when you think about when you're anxious, then your soul, your spirit, your sense is unrelaxed. But nachat ruach has this sort of connotation of just being able to sort of sit back and enjoy something, and to savor, right? To savor something. So here now we get into more and more specifics as to what we're talking about. Excuse me. Vehikriv hamakriv korbano lashem, and the one hamakriv, the one who offers up, hikriv offers korbano, his offering to God, his sacrifice. The one who sacrifices his sacrifice to God. Just that, all that repetition, right? Mincha, so he has to bring along with it mincha solet, an offering of fine flour. Solet is fine flour. Isaron, 1/10 part, and balul, mixed with berivi'it, in a quarter of a hin of shaman, of oil. So this is, we've come across this before, back in Leviticus when we were discussing meal offerings. So along with the offering of the animal, there are these accompanying offerings that come along with it. So the side dishes, we might call them, right? Vehikriv hamakriv. So the one who offers up the offering shall offer. Takrivu nisachim umincha. You shall bring nisachim, or libations, umincha, and flour, a meal offering, lechol behema, for each animal. Okay, hamincha kalil. The mincha, the meal offering, is completely burned. V'hashem nivlal betocha, and the oil is mixed in with it, into the meal, into the flour. V'hayayin, and the wine, we haven't mentioned this yet, but there is wine that is part of that libation. Lasfalim, for these basins, put into basins. Kamoshe shaninu, as we learn b'mesechet Sukkah, in the tractate Sukkah, we learn about these particular accompanying offerings. So here we have the wine mentioned. V'yayin lanesech, and wine as a libation. Revi'it hahin, a quarter of a hin. Ta'aseh, you shall perform, you shall do. Al ha'olah, along with the olah offering, or lazavach. So, or either with the whole offering or with the sacrifice, la keves ha'achad, for one lamb. For one lamb. So the amount of libation and accompanying meal offering is this particularly specific amounts that are commanded to be brought along with the animal. It isn't just the animal, but these accompaniments to it. La keves ha'echad. So remember, because we just had this sentence about Vayayin lanesech revi'it taseh, we might think that it's only referring to the wine. But the answer is al kol ha'amur lamala. It's referring to all the various ingredients that were mentioned above. Humusav al hamincha. So this sentence here is dependent on the mincha, is referring to the meal offering, the al hashemen, and on the oil, the al hayayin, and on the wine. So that has to do with lambs. Or la'ayil, or for a ram, ta'aseh mincha, you should bring a meal offering, solet, of fine flour, shnei isronim, so it's double the amount, 2/10 of a part. I believe it's an ephah, blula v'shemen, so 2/10 of this fine flour, blula, mixed in b'shemen, with oil, shlishit ha'in, which is a third part of a hin. Before it was a revi'it, before it was a quarter of a hin, but this is a third of a hin. So you notice how if it's a larger animal and it takes more libation, more accompanying foods. Let's take a look here. Or la'ayil, or for a ram. The im ayil, so he's just interpolating here. Rashi's interpolating. If it happens to be a ram, and this is from Tractate Menachot, which deals with these meal offerings. V'rabtenu darshu or, and our rabbis interpreted this word or, right? Because it's an interesting correlation to the previous part. So in other words, we're sort of linking in a special kind of way the keves and the ayil, right? And you'll see what that takes into account. In other words, the word or is an inclusive, it's understood as an inclusive word to imply including something that isn't necessarily specifically mentioned, right? Lerabot et hapalgas. They understood the or to include, what was this including? The palgas. Palgas is a lamb older than a keves. A keves is 1 year old, I believe, and a ayil is more than a year. It could be 2 years, or maybe it's even a smaller distinction there, but it's younger than an ayil. And because the O is linked to an ayil, even though it is not an ayil yet, the nichse ayil, they said a palgas requires the same libations as an ayil, even though it's not mentioned specifically, but it's implied with this word O right here. V'yayin lanesech, and the wine for the libation, shlishit hahin, 1/3 of a hin. It's again just like the third of a hin of oil, right? So here we have 1/3 of a hin of wine. Takriv, you shall offer up reach nichoach l'Hashem, as an offering of pleasing savor to Hashem, to God. Going on. V'chi, so we still have one more category to deal with. Ta'aseh ben bakar, and where if you were to bring a ben bakar, that is I believe, we're now talking about a calf, okay, olah or zavach, either as an olah or as an offering. The falei neder, to fulfill an oath, or shlamim, or the shlamim ladonai. So shlamim are another kind of offering. Basically, they're by way of acknowledgement or thanksgiving. Okay. And let me see. Let's keep going here. V'hikriv al ben habakar, and you should bring for the literally it means the son of cattle, and that's because it's, I believe, like a yearling. It's a very young calf. Mincha, you should bring a mincha, a meal offering. Solet, again, notice the repetition here and the parallel language, and that's the way in which one sort of recognizes that it's legal material, that the language is legalistic. Right? Solet, fine flour, shlosha esronim, 3/10. So 1/10 for a lamb, 2/10 for a ram, 3/10 for a calf. Velul bashemen, mixed with oil, chatzi ha'in, and the amount of oil is a half in. So remember, we had a quarter, a third, and here is a half. V'yayin takriv lanesech, and you shall bring wine as a libation, chatzi hahin, and as we might expect, the amount of wine was also 1/2 of a hin. Isher reach nichoach ladonai, or Hashem, a fire offering of pleasing savor to Hashem. Rashi, Isher reach. Eino musav ella al hamincha v'hashemen. This is only referring back to the meal offering and the oil. Aval hayayin, but he says, but with regard to the wine, eino ishe, you cannot consider it an ishe, a fire offering. She'eino nitan al ha'esh, because the wine wasn't placed on the fire. So it's not even, so here when it refers to Isha, it's only referring to the meal offering, the flour and the fine flour and the oil. And with that, we will conclude this morning's lesson. Well, I'll finish up. Forgive me. I'm in too quick here. Let's try this out, right? Kacha ye'aseh, thus shall it be performed. L'shor ha'echad, for one ox is a shor, or la'ayil ha'echad, or for one ram, or laseh, or for a lamb, bakvasim or va'izim. And what is added in this sentence is that we realize that when they're talking about a lamb, they're not talking just about a sheep, but also izim, a goat. Or laseh, so he's talking about or laseh, or for a sheep, bein shehu baksavim, whether he is from the sheep, the flock of sheep, bein shehu ba'izim, or whether it is from the goats. Keves v'seh kruyim bitoch shnatam. So he says, here we go. This is where he defines it, what I mentioned before, both forgive me, a lamb and so I think, whether it's a lamb or it's a sheep, kruyim betoch shnatam, that refers to there are yearlings. Now, here we go. Ayil, when it comes to a ram, ben shlosha asar chodesh. So it is then 13 months and 1 day. So this answers the question about defining a palgas. So because a sheep or a lamb that they're referring to in the Torah is yearling, okay, and the ram is 13 months and a day, we have this month and a day in between, and that would be the age of a palgas. So, and that's a good place for us to stop today. Oops, sorry. Go in here. And if there are any comments or questions, I'd be happy to take them if you want them for the record, and otherwise we'll stop the share. Yeah, go ahead.
Now, what about the poor people? They can only have pigeons or something like that. They don't have rams or cows or something like that. There's got to be something for them too.
Yes, true. But in that case, they bring the meal offering as well. So they can afford, if they can't even afford birds, they can afford meal offerings. So it's
Uh-huh.
interesting that the wealthy, the people who are of better means, still have to bring a meal offering in order to legitimate these offerings. And your question is arising for me, the idea that they shouldn't feel so distinguished or distinct from the people who cannot afford such offerings of animals, right? So as far as the offerings brought on festivals, those were public offerings, so they were from everyone. And the other offerings that I mentioned are free will offerings, which are going to depend on your circumstances. But it does talk about mincha offerings elsewhere. And I think that what you're bringing out, Harlan, is the connection. Whether you're wealthy or whether you're not wealthy, you're still connected through these meal offerings and the wine that's associated with them and the oil, because the probabilities are that you can't afford that. I'm going to stop the recording at this point.